again and welcome to another Warhammer 40k Mordy and Glory video. In today's episode, we are going to be asking and answering one simple question. With the recent changes to Warhammer 40k, is Imperial Guard artillery now dead? Now, I know for a lot of Imperial Guard commanders, the artillery is the big draw towards the faction. There is nothing quite as epic looking as a battery of basilisks pointing their barrels to the heavens. And not only has this looked aesthetically very appealing, but artillery has been an essential component for a lot of Imperial Guard commanders. But with the recent changes to the balanced data slate, many players are looking at their fast support units and thinking, are my big guns still going to be useful, or should I start pivoting away from indirect fire and instead focusing on my tank corps? Well, do not panic. I have some good news for all of my gunnery crews out there. In my opinion, artillery is still very much in the game, a vital component of your plans, and you are still going to want to include some of it in your army. And what I'm going to do in this video is go over the problem, but then take you through the solutions so you can still get the most out of your favorite big guns. And with that said, let's main gun range, shatter their sky, and dive straight into this. So the first thing that we need to do is understand what the problems with the artillery are. Now, the big thing that's got everybody worried is Guard is now affected by the indirect fire nerf on the balanced data slate. This nerf states that if you have a weapon that does not require line of sight and you choose to fire it indirectly, then your ballistic skill characteristic is reduced by 1 and your opponent's armor save characteristic is improved by 1. Now, this rule was introduced a few balanced data slates ago, but up until this point, Guard had an exception. And the reason we had an exception to it is because our old 8th edition codex really needed every little bit of help it could get. And if you were going to start chopping the legs out from underneath the artillery corps, Guard were just going to be struggling even more than they already were. But now that we have our new 9th edition codex, Games Workshop believes that our faction is powerful enough to be able to stand on its own 2 feet, not need exceptions or special rules, and so now we have got to play by the same nerfs as everybody else. So our artillery is also going to be affected by this. But in my opinion, this nerf doesn't treat Guard equally, it actually affects us more than everybody else. And the reasons for that is fairly simple. Firstly, Guard artillery ballistic skill is fairly low. We only tend to have a 4+ ballistic skill on our artillery pieces. And on top of this, we have way more indirect fire options than anybody else. Our whole thing is we fire big guns at people. And so whilst this nerf might mean that Marine Whirlwinds have got -1 to hit and the enemy's getting a bit better save, oh, you've affected like 1 data sheet in that codex, when it comes to the Guard, you're affecting dozens of data sheets between all of the various fire support weapons that we have that can shoot without needing line of sight. On top of this, another problem is that reducing the ballistic skill of a unit by 1 is not the same as applying a -1 to hit modifier. When you reduce ballistic skill by 1, what you are essentially doing is going to that unit's data sheet and physically altering that 4+ to hit to a 5+ to hit. But a -1 to hit modifier is where you roll the dice, you see if you got a hit, and then you -1 from the result of the dice. Now, the reason that this distinction is so important is it means that you can stack reduced ballistic skill by 1 with a -1 to hit modifier. Therefore, if you have a unit such as a Basilisk and it is shooting at, let's say, a Dark Elder unit with an inbuilt -1 to hit, and you fire indirectly, your ballistic skill gets reduced to a 5+, and then any dice roll that you roll has a -1 to hit modifier applied to it, which actually means your Basilisk would only be able to hit that enemy unit on a 6+. And it is this accumulative effect which is so crippling to the Guard artillery corps and is what is causing many people to say that RT is dead and you need to be pivoting into other stuff now. But that's not all, because the other part of the indirect fire nerf says that your opponent gets to improve their armor save characteristic, which again means you're going into that data sheet and you could be changing, let's say, a Space Marine armor save from a 3+ to a 2+. And then if that Marine is in cover, they get the benefits of light cover, which gives them another +1 armor save, which means that essentially a Marine would be on a 1+ save against an artillery piece shooting at them whilst they are hiding in some cover. And so the combined effect of both the reduced ballistic skill plus the improved armor save and all of the other factors that can stack on there means that your physical damage output of your unit is drastically reduced whilst your opponent's durability is significantly increased. Overall, you're just going to really struggle to do any damage with these units at their base level. But moving on from the indirect fire nerf and the balanced data slate, there are a few other factors that you're going to encounter that are going to cause you problems when using guard arty. The first one, and a lot of people get this wrong, is that the dense cover rules still affect you even if you're firing out of line of sight. That is right. If your opponent is hiding behind some dense terrain, even if you are firing indirectly, if your basilisk has to draw line of sight across the dense, it's still going to be hit by a -1 modifier. It's stupid. I don't like the way this dense cover works with line of sight blocking, but it is the way it works. Even if you are shooting at an enemy unit that is nowhere near some dense terrain, maybe it's way over on the other side of the battlefield, but you have to draw line of sight from your basilisk across the battlefield through that dense terrain that might be just sat in the middle of the board, it doesn't matter. You're still going to get hit by a -1 hit modifier. It is, like I said, a very silly rule. Now, looking specifically at the guard units, the problem with artillery in the new book is that it is relatively expensive when compared to other support and damage dealing units. For example, a Basilisk is going to cost you 140 points base, and a Lehman Russ is going to cost you 155 points when you take into account you have to pay for that first heavy bolt that goes in the front. So there's only a 15-point difference between these two units, and when you consider how much tougher and how much more damage output a Lehman Russ can achieve, it does make you question why Basilisks are quite expensive. One other small problem that a lot of guard commanders are finding with their traditional fire support units, like the Basilisk, like the Manticore, is that they're struggling to give them the order support that they need. Sure, you've got tank commanders that can tell them, gunners kill on sight, get your reroll ones to hit, have a good time, son. But the thing is, if you've got a tank commander babysitting a bunch of artillery, you're not really getting the most out of him. And on a lot of competitive boards, if your tank commander is just sat in the same position, he really is not going to be able to get those angles that he needs himself so that he can actually contribute to the fight. And that covers a lot of the problems that artillery are facing at the moment. And I'm not going to lie to you, these aren't small issues. If left unchecked, these factors can simply kill artillery dead, and you're not going to want to take them. But we are not going to leave these issues untreated. We're going to take a look at some solutions and how you can start falling in love with your big guns again. Now, the first thing that we need to acknowledge is that there is still a great deal of indirect fire support options that are highly efficient and effective on the battlefield. The classic guard mortar pit is still a very good tactic. If you don't know what the mortar pit is, it's where you take 3 heavy weapon squads and you give each squad 3 mortars for a total of 9 light mortars. Each one of these squads only costs you 55 points and they put out 3d6 shots, and those shots are now better than before because mortars in the 8th edition book had a strength of 4 and in the 9th edition book they have a strength of 5. Mortars have got the core keyword and the regimental keyword, which means they have easy access to both reroll ones to hit via Arcade and Castellan, reroll ones to wound via a command squad with the regimental standard, and also plenty of order support. You can even take this a step further and pair a classic mortar pit with Ursula Creed, so she can give all of those mortars +1 strength via her Castellan's Fury ability, so suddenly you have got strength 6 mortars. Whether you are a newer guard player who's trying to figure out how to get some indirect fire into his army, or you are a longbeard trying to come to grips with the new lay of the land and the new codex, I can strongly suggest that you consider mortars and the classic mortar pit to be your first port of call when you're looking to add indirect fire into your army. But if you're looking for something that's a little bit stronger than a trio of light mortar teams, you may want to start taking a look at the new field ordnance batteries. These guys can be equipped with a variety of weapons. You have the heavy las cannon and the Malleus rocket launcher, which can both be fired directly, but I actually think their best weapon, considering that they are quite fragile, is the field bombast gun, which allows them to fire indirectly. Affectionately named the Mini Basilisk, this gun has a 48-inch range, strength 7, AP -2, and flat 2 damage, and it fires D6 shots. Now, each field ordnance battery comes with 2 guns and costs 130 points. I know some commanders are a little bit hesitant about the field ordnance battery. They think they're a bit expensive for what you get, but what you have to remember is that in comparison to mortars, they are much tougher, and also the shells that they are putting out are much bigger. Now, a lot of guard commanders make the mistake of comparing the field ordnance battery with the bombast field gun to the mortar, and they say the mortar is so much cheaper, why would I want to pay for the bombast guns? Well, what you have to understand is you shouldn't be comparing it to a light fire support weapon like the mortar. That job is to go after chaff and to just harass the enemy. The field ordnance battery is a big gun. It is designed to do damage to the enemy and to actually be able to follow through once it's hit the enemy. You should be comparing it to the Basilisk, which is 10 points cheaper than. In addition to being cheaper, it also comes with the regimental keyword, and this is very important. As you'll see later on, it allows you to easily counter the indirect fire nerf. But just before we talk about that, another factor that you need to take into account, another solution that you can have to the problems that are facing your artillery, is the fact that the Master of Ordnance now actually works. In previous editions, he was kind of useless. He gave reroll 1s to hit to artillery that was nearby, as long as the thing they were shooting at was over 36 inches away. But with 9th edition and smaller board sizes, things were very, very rarely over 36 inches away. So literally, he often did nothing. Now, in your command phase, you get to pick one enemy unit that is within 30 inches of the massive ordnance and that he can see, and all guard artillery pieces on the battlefield that target that enemy unit get reroll 1s to hit. This is a brilliant ability that affects all of your big guns, from the new field ordnance batteries all the way up to your Basilisk and your Manticores. Now, I've heard of a lot of chit and chat around the barracks water cooler saying that this ability isn't worth it, because people argue that when is he going to be within 30-inch range and being able to see something on a competitive board? He's going to be too busy babysitting the artillery pieces. Now, this is very backwards thinking with a lot of holdovers from the last edition, because the Massive Ordnance doesn't need to be within 6 inches of any friendly artillery anymore. Your Massive Ordnance could be on the other side of the battlefield and still be able to give reroll 1s to hit to the artillery against the unit that he has painted and marked for death. How you want to be using this guy is you want to be embedding him with one of your command squads that's going to be near the front lines, helping your platoons push forward onto objectives trying to get primary points. This will give him lots of opportunities to see enemy units that he can use his artillery commander ability on, and therefore you should have no problem getting those rerolls off every single turn. And the best bit is, he now only costs 25 points. Now, I know what you're thinking, but Mordian Glory, apart from that Massive Ordnance being able to get some reroll 1s out there, this doesn't really address the problem of the indirect fire nerf, which is that we are hitting less often and our opponents have got better armor saves. Well, this is where the new guard orders and regimental doctrines kick in, and they provide a number of elegant solutions and ways of getting around this indirect fire problem. The most straightforward and easiest solution is that the take aim regimental order just flat out cancels and counters the indirect fire nerf for mortars and field ordnance batteries. Take aim gives you +1 to hit, which counters the -1 ballistic skill, and it also gives you -1 AP on your guns, which counters the +1 armor save for the enemy. It just levels the playing field and puts things back where they were. Now, I can't stress that point enough. We're back to where we were before. Look at all of these points that we've just been talking about. Mortars being operated by Acadian Castellan. That is just your classic mortar pit. Those mortars are going to have take aim, which gets past the indirect fire nerf, and oh look, they're going to have reroll ones to hit, just like they did before. And then you start looking at your field Ordnance batteries, and you're like, okay, those have also got take aim on them. So again, we've got past the indirect fire nerf, and oh look, easy access to reroll ones to hit, just like back in the day when you used to take those Cadian basilisks. And I probably could end the video right now and go, guys, look, mission accomplished. We've fixed the artillery. It's back to where it was. Let's crack on. But I understand that we've not quite solved all the problems yet, because what we've been looking at is the new field Ordnance batteries. But what about our old basilisks? What about our old manticores? How can we get them to at least be usable on the tabletop and not be actively handicapping our lists? Now, the first thing that we can do is pick regimental doctrines that are going to support our artillery. Now, if you're thinking of just sliding one basilisk into your list, then this probably isn't something you want to do. You don't want to build all these doctrines just around one unit. But if you are going heavily into artillery, taking 2 or 3 artillery pieces, and they are going to be a key part of your game plan, then this is absolutely the path you're going to want to go down. So if you are going heavily into artillery and it is going to form an important part of your game plan, the first regimental doctrine that I would recommend is expert bombardiers. Units with this doctrine gain the expert bombardiers keyword, and each time an artillery model with this doctrine makes a ranged attack, if the target of that attack is within 12 inches off and visible to a friendly Voxcaster or Sentinel unit, add 1 to that attack's hit rolls. What this doctrine is essentially allowing you to do is have your Sentinels and your infantry squads spot and call in artillery bombardments to help them out. Now, one of the problems with this doctrine is it does require your Sentinels or your infantry squads or Death Corps of Krieg, whichever's got a Voxcaster, to be within 12 inches. That is pretty close, and I know that a lot of players instinctively are going to say, well, I might not get within 12 inches for 2 or 3 turns, and then I've just not been able to use my regimental doctrine as effectively as I would have liked to. Now, I'm going to push back against that assumption, because firstly, if you're taking this regimental doctrine and you're leaning into those big guns, you're going to take Scout Sentinels. Scout Sentinels can forward deploy. They can be 9 inches away from the enemy deployment zone. If you get first turn, they can do a big 12-inch move. And so if you get turn 1 and you've got Scout Sentinels in your list, you absolutely should be able to use expert bombardiers right from the get-go. But let's not plan for the best case scenario. Let's take a look at a worst case scenario, which is where you don't get first turn. And let's say your Sentinels have either died turn 1, or you've been sensible, you've taken the Mass Tactician Warlord trait and you've redeployed the Scout Sentinels backwards so that you can keep them safe. You might be saying to yourself, but Morning Glory, now I'm definitely not going to be able to use it turn 1. I wouldn't be so sure. Most games of 40k devolve very quickly into a big brawl in no man's land around those middle primary objectives. And there's a very good reason for this. You need to be pushing onto those primary objectives, no matter what army you are, no matter what kind of player you are, to be able to score primary points and to be able to win games. Therefore, in most games of 40k, even if you go second, you're going to find, even as early as turn 1, you're probably going to be able to get some of your units with Voxcasters or your Sentinels within 12 inches of the enemy. And even if you don't, you might have to wait till turn 2. It really isn't the end of the world. What I'm saying is you're going to be spending 80% of the game with units within 12 inches of your opponent. So if we can safely assume you are taking expert bombardiers if you want to take lots of artillery, then what are you going to pick as your second regimental doctrine? Now, I have 3 suggestions for you. The first one is mechanized infantry. This will allow you to put your Voxcaster equipped infantry in chimeras, move them forward, get out, and from very early on, you could be triggering X bombardiers. You'll be within 12 inches of the enemy. You're going to be having a great time. In a similar vein, you could take recon operators. This gives you a pre-game move and once again allows you to close that distance, get within 12 inches, start triggering expert bombardiers straight away, and getting around that indirect fire nerf. If you're struggling to pick between these two, I would suggest that it comes down to really two factors that you're going to want to consider. The first one is that with mechanized infantry, you are going to be able to move 12 inches with those chimeras and get out, and that will give you a 15-inch move, which really helps you start triggering expert bombardiers early on. So you're going to be faster with mechanized infantry, but you do have to pay for those chimeras. And every point that you spend on a chimera is not points that you're spending on more big guns. So take that into account. Recon operators is kind of the opposite. It's slower. You only get a 6-inch pre-game move. Doesn't matter if your sentinel can move 12 inches. It only gets a 6-inch pre-game move. But it doesn't cost you any points. So you will have more left over to put into the artillery. So you have to decide which one of those kind of fits into your game plan. Now, the third regimental doctrine you could pick is a little bit different, but you could go for elite sharpshooters. That gives you a reroll to hit with every single one of your units. Now, one of the big problems, even if you do manage to use take aim or expert bombardiers to get round the indirect fire nerf, is you're still only hitting on 4s. Still means 50% of your shots are going to miss. And so anything that can increase the number of shots that you're going to hit, increase the number of contacts that you're getting, is great. And what you have to remember is that the hard part with artillery is getting the hits. They tend to be very high strength weapons. Once you've got the hits, you're going to get the wounds more often than not. And so really, I think that elite sharpshooters is good because it does increase your damage output, and that's always a good thing. But there is one last problem with artillery that I haven't yet given you a solution for. And that is the one where I said you need a tank commander to sit with your more old school artillery, like Basilisks and Manticores, in order to be able to hand out mechanized orders to them so that they can get reroll ones to hit. And that's not a great use of an expensive tank commander, because really he should be out there doing damage. Now, you could take a massive ordnance and in a command squad, and that's going to cost you 100 points. It's still cheaper than a tank commander, but it's not a cheap solution. And to be honest with you guys, that solution is primarily there for the field ordnance batteries, because they can't get reroll ones to hit from a Castellan. They can't get reroll ones to wound from a command squad. So primarily that's for the field ordnance batteries, because that's the only way they can get reroll ones. But your Basilisks and your Manticores actually have a really cheap way of being able to get reroll ones. It doesn't require a tank commander. You can take a Commissar, who's going to cost you 40 points, and you can give him the Warlord trait, Superior Tactical Training. This means that your Commissar can do a kind of order that he doesn't already know. So he comes with Perfector's orders, and you could simply pick that he is able to do mechanized orders, and suddenly he can just hand out Gunner's Kill on sight to your artillery corps. So that covers the solutions to the problems with artillery and the indirect fire nerf specifically. I know a question is going to pop up, which is, which route would you go down, Mordy and Glory? And I think that they both have their advantages and disadvantages. If you decide to go down mortars and field ordnance batteries, then you will be able to get around the indirect fire nerf easily just by using take aim. But the problem is on your bigger guns, like your bombast cannons, you are likely to struggle a little bit to get reroll ones on them. On the other hand, if you are a more traditional player, you want to keep using your Basilisks, Manticores, and etc., then you're going to struggle a little bit with getting around the -1 to hit unless you really focus your regiment into it. But you are going to have easy access to reroll ones with that Commissar and in a pinch with your tank commanders. And so it's likely going to come down to a mixture of player preference and game plan. I would say that if you're really wanting to build a heavy artillery army, probably going down the second option with expert bombardiers, elite sharpshooters is the way to go. If you're taking just a seasoning of indirect fire to try and support your tanks and your infantry, and that's where your main focus is, going with the newer route, the first option with take aim, is probably the way to go. Now, before we wrap up the video, I do want to make a few other quick points around why I believe artillery isn't dead and why it's still absolutely vital on the battlefield. The first thing you need to take into account is that Don't think about damage output when you're thinking about artillery. I've talked about this before. I've done a whole series of videos on the fundamentals of using artillery in your guard, and you should never be thinking about it as how much can these things kill. If you want to do damage, you take tanks. If you want to take objectives, you take infantry. Artillery is there to support. And there are loads of big brain ways that you can use your artillery to not worry about hurting your enemy, but to mess up their game plans and to really use that harassing fire principle. For example, you could tell your mortars and your field ordnance batteries to use pinning fire. That way it doesn't matter how much damage they do, all you're looking for is 5 hits. If you get that, suddenly your opponent is -1 to hit. That can really affect armies like Tau, who rely upon mark lights to get +1 to hit, to get them onto that 3s to hit. Tau do not like hitting you on 4s. Likewise, Custodies really don't like hitting you on 3s. Applying -1 hit modifiers to your opponent is a great way of reducing their damage output, increasing your survivability, and overall just messing with their head. In addition to this, you could use suppressive fire on your self-propelled artillery to start putting movement modifiers on your opponent. Imagine if you come across a Deathwing army, which are apparently going to be becoming very popular with Arcs of Omen, and they're trying to stomp across the battlefield 5 inches a turn. Well, you know what? Have a -2 to hit modifier every single turn. It doesn't matter if I don't kill you. I'm literally just trying to stop you from moving around and doing what you want to do. And suddenly, most of your opponent's army is on a 3-inch movement. He's never going to get anywhere. It's a great way of winning the game without actually doing any damage to your opponent. In addition to this, one cool way that I think you can use artillery is by giving them the Remain Vigilant order. Now, this will only work on your mortars and your field ordnance batteries because it's a commissar order, but what that order does is it means enemies can't deep strike within 12 inches of you. This is great because it means that they won't be able to get into your back lines to start threatening your big guns with some deep strikers, but it also means that they won't be able to get into those little nooks and crannies very easily to try and do things like retrieve battlefield data. It's just great, and on top of this, it has the added bonus of freeing up some other units. Let's say you had an infantry squad or 2 that was just being strung out around in your deployment zone to stop people deep striking in. Well, guess what? Those 10, 20, 30 infantry that were doing that are now free to be pushed forward into the middle of the board and to add more pressure to the offensive, which is great. But one of the most important points about artillery, the main reason you take it, is so that you can harass your enemy's backfield objective. How many games have we played where your opponent has put a single unit of intercessors or sister battle or Tau Fire Warriors on a backfield objective and just used it to hold it? And it's like, oh, well, that's just like 4 primary points every single turn. If you can deny the ability for your opponent to do that by just shelling that basic bitch unit, it's going to really start screwing up his plans, because either he has to go all in and like, right, I just need to capture the center, which is a very risky strategy, or more likely he'll have to direct something from his center board push, which he doesn't want to, back towards holding his backfield objective, something that's got a bit more durability, because if he doesn't send something good back, you're just going to blow it up again. And so it means that your opponent doesn't have as much momentum, and suddenly the initiative starts swinging towards you. And that is the #1 reason for taking artillery, and that has not changed. Now, there are a couple of other quick points that I want to make here before wrapping up the video. The first one is that the indirect fire nerf affects everyone, not just guard. And as a result, most armies have just dropped any kind of indirect fire from their army. They're like, you know what, it's not worth it, I'm not going to bother with it. The advantage to us as guard, and as you can see with our solutions around the indirect fire nerf, is it means that we still get to pound on the enemy with relatively the same effectiveness, but there's almost no counter battery fire coming our way. And that means even if 1 or 2 turns of artillery fire doesn't produce a result, you will be able to fire your guns every single turn, and cumulatively, you're probably going to do quite a lot of damage with them. So this lack of counter battery really does give guard big guns pretty free reign on the battlefield. On top of this, despite the fact that the enemy does get +1 armor save when you shoot at them indirect, Armor of Contempt is dead. It's gone. It's finite. It is one with the angels. It has gone to die by the Emperor's side, okay? And that means that at least if you are shooting them indirectly with something like a Basilisk or a Manticore Field Ordnance Battery, they might be getting +1 save. They might be getting light cover, but at least they're not getting on top of that reduce AP by 1, which tends to mean that if you're take aim on your field ordnance batteries and you get them up to AP 3, that means that you're still able to take a pip of armor save off someone. And also, if you're hitting the enemy with one of your bigger self-propelled guns that's got AP -3, again, likewise, you aren't just going to be putting them down to their base save. You should be able to actually take them down a peg and reduce their armor save. So armor content being gone is pretty good for artillery, despite the fact that the enemy might be getting +1 to their save. So, in conclusion, artillery is certainly not dead, and hopefully you guys can see it still has loads of uses on the battlefield. I'm not going to lie to you, it is more complicated overall, there are more moving parts, but it can be made to work. Any of you guard commanders out there considering artillery need to think about those other factors outside of killing power. That ability to give your opponent -1 to hit. That ability to be able to reduce their movement. That ability to be able to harass their backfield objectives. And to be a bit clever with remain vigilant and push enemy deep strikers back. Overall, you have to remember that the environment around artillery has changed. And once we take into account all these buffs and things that we can put on them, the end result is actually probably the same as it was before, which means it's as good as it always has been. But those are just my thoughts on artillery and why I think it's still very viable. But what do you guys think? Let me know down in that comment section below. Are you still planning on taking your Basilisk? Are you switching over to field ordnance batteries? Let me know what you're thinking down in that comment section. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, please make sure you smash that like button and of course subscribe to never miss an episode. If you have really enjoyed today's video or you have found it particularly helpful and you want to see more content like this, then please consider becoming a channel member or Patreon supporter. One of the big perks of being a channel member or patron is you do gain access to the Mordian Glory Discord, which is an online community of almost 900 active members. It's always popping off in there. There's always someone to talk to about tactics, lists, memes, painting, hobbying, all sorts of stuff. It's a great resource as well because we've got loads of experienced players in there, and it's also just genuinely a really friendly and welcoming community. And I just want to take a moment now to say a big thank you to all of the latest channel members. So thank you to Trips Clips, Michael Vosberg, Lee9055, Levi Hecker, Bergosaurus, Mark Alperin, Matthew Bishop, Sack McCull, 6-4 Crusader, Josh, Matthew Holmes, and Verado255. Thank you guys for doing your part. Thank you for becoming channel members. And I also want to give a shout out to the latest Patreon supporters as well. So thank you to Alan Blount III, Dale Cromwell, Akashareka, Red Morrison, Nate, Janet Wicks, Reese Jones, and the Baneblade. And last, but certainly not least, I want to say a personal, heartfelt thank you to all of my top tier Patreon supporters. These are the War Masters, the people who have truly gone above and beyond the call of duty. So I want to say a big thank you and an 07 to Alan Blount III, Bonbon Vert, Phil French, Ross Miller, Swordfish Trombone, Tequal, Alex Stengal, John Stubbs, Nick Walsh, Diesel Fox, Tom Sutton, and of course, August Varney. Thank you guys for your very generous and ongoing support. It truly is a big reason of how I'm able to do Mordian Glory full time now. So thank you so much. I hope you've all enjoyed today's video. Thank you for watching. And of course, as always, I'll see you guys next time.